What was Rabbi Avraham HaKohen Kook's attitude towards Zionism?
Rav Kook's attitude to Zionism was, in a word, ambivalent. This, of course, was not the case with regards to most of the leading rabbis of that time. We're speaking about approximately 120 years ago, the early 20th century. Most great rabbis were opposed quite vehemently to the Zionist movement for the very obvious reason that it was expressly and explicitly self-described as a secular movement. In fact, they stressed that they had nothing, the Zionist movement, had nothing to do with the religion or with Judaism as a religion, that their agenda was very different. And therefore, it comes perhaps as a surprise to learn that a great rabbi, Orthodox rabbi, considered one of the leading rabbis of his generation, Rabbi Kook, was not simply opposed like most other rabbis, most of his colleagues, but rather held a much more ambivalent, took a much more ambivalent view of things. On the one hand, the Zionist movement was clearly secular and even anti-Torah. They described themselves as having nothing to do with Judaism. They advocated a secularist attitude, and that is all, of course, against the spirit of the Jewish people's history and the entire civilization that the Jewish people have produced over the last 4,000 years. But on the other hand, Rav Kook understood, as few in his time did, that this was Hashem's doing. In other words, he understood that the Jewish people had to return to their ancestral land en masse. They had to rebuild that land almost from scratch, which was, of course, an immense undertaking of historical proportions, nearly superhuman proportions. Many people did not believe it could be done, and they were not far wrong. It was truly an historic undertaking, the likes of which we have not seen in human affairs, perhaps ever at all, in the annals of human history. Rav Kook understood that the Jewish people had to return and begin this process of rebuilding their land and returning in ever-increasing numbers to the land of Israel. And he also understood that the Jews who were loyal to the Torah, who walked in the footsteps of their forefathers, were not capable of such a feat. They were so bogged down, living what I refer to as Galuth mode Judaism. In other words, they had become so used to living in the exile, living outside of Eretz Yisrael, and therefore not really understanding or grasping at all what needed to be done, and what kind of a revolution was required in order to bring the beginnings of the process of redemption about. Rav Kook understood this was not going to take place within the Torah community. And he saw further that it was precisely those Jews who had dropped out of traditional Judaism, on the one hand, but who, on the other hand, maintained a an intellectual and emotional attachment to the Jewish people, and who believed in the justice and the necessity of the Jewish people returning to their homeland, people who were highly educated and had learnt and become proficient in the ways of the world as to how to bring about such changes, how to set up such a movement, how to put things into practice. Those kinds of people were not to be found, unfortunately, in the Torah world. They had to be found, they had to be imported, as it were, from those Jews who were no longer considered themselves Torah Jews at all. And therefore, it was an act of divine providence, so Rav Kook understood and claimed, on the part of Hashem, the Creator, to bring about this new twist in Jewish history, and this open up a new period, in fact, in Jewish history, bring about the final redemption in a long, down-to-earth, entirely natural, and that is to say non-supernatural way. Rav Kook did not believe in a Geula, redemption, based on miracles and the like. He understood that the Geula had to come about through the efforts and the agency of human beings, of Jews who were willing to do whatever it took to make these things happen. And he understood that only those Jews who had turned their backs on the Torah were those who actually possessed those qualities and that kind of vision and those kinds of skills and talents. And therefore Hashem directed these people and inspired these people to do so. Having said that, we must not lose sight of the fact that Rav Kook also felt strongly that those secular Zionists, although bringing about, putting things into motion in order to bring about an immense change in the course of the Jewish people's march through history, they were nevertheless, in the words of the Prophet, they were zera' behema. In other words, these were vulgar and unrefined people, by and large, who were far removed from the philosophical, spiritual, moral aspects of Judaism. Those Jews referred to by the Prophet as Zera' Adam. Zera' Adam refers to the descendants of men, and Zera' Behema refers to the descendants of beasts. In other words, people who were much more down to earth on the one hand, but lacking refinement and moral clarity and religious inclination, as opposed to the Zera' Adam, the more finely, more refined, and those more attuned to religious and moral notions. Those kinds of people, he understood, were not part of the Zionist movement, except perhaps in the form of what was called the Mizrahi. The Mizrahi was the so-called religious wing of the Zionist movement. They referred to themselves as the Mizrahi, and they were a small minority within the Zionist movement. And this is a very important point to note. Rav Kook felt that the only justification for Torah Jews to be associated with the secular anti-Torah Zionist movement was to constantly remind their fellow travelers within that movement that the Jewish people do not aspire to some just one more modern state in which they might speak Hebrew, but rather the state the Jewish people must aspire to establish is a state very much unlike other non-Jewish states. It must be a state based on the precepts and values and concepts of the Torah. And it was Rav Kook's position that the Mizrahi was not fulfilling the role within the Zionist movement. And we have an interesting correspondence, a letter written by Rav Kook to Rav Meir Berlin, who was later known as Rav Meir Bar-Ilan, who was at that time the head of that wing of the Zionist movement, the Mizrahi. And I will quote just a few words from that letter. Rav Kook here writes to Rav Bar-Ilan, and he says that the Mizrahi movement must always expressly state that the statements made by the Zionist movement that Zionism has nothing to do with Judaism, with Torah Judaism, is a disgraceful and entirely inaccurate statement. And this is something the Mizrahi has to constantly, an issue they have to constantly raise and constantly remind the rest of the Zionist movement that this is not the case, that the true essence and the entire meaning of the Jewish people is wrapped up with the essential concepts and ideas of Torah Judaism, and that this is the only real purpose and aim of the Zionist movement. And Rav Kook goes on to say that if the Mizrahi does not do so, then really they don't really have any reason or function within the Zionist movement. And he refers to the two kinds of people that within the Zionist movement. He says, Zera Adam lahod wa Zera Behema lahod. We know that Chazal explain, the sages explain, that sometimes two kinds of Jews work together to achieve a certain aim, a certain purpose, but some of them, as we said before, are the Zera Adam, the more spiritually inclined, those who are more in touch with their Jewish roots and background, and the Zera Behema, who are not. They are Jews, but they are essentially not engaged with the Jewish background and all that implies. And he says the Mizrahi movement has to expressly pronounce these truths without fear, and he goes on to say, De'oth memutha'oth ufashrani'oth, middle of the road and lukewarm opinions and statements are not going to provide the direction and inject any kind of life and meaning into the Zionist movement. Basically, he is, in a polite way, saying to Rabbi Bar-Ilan, the Mizrahi movement is much too lukewarm and mealy-mouthed about being critical of the lack of real Jewish content within the Zionist movement, and that this is exactly what the Mizrahi should be doing. So we see that Rav Kook was critical of the Mizrahi movement, and this is why Rav Kook never officially belonged to the Mizrahi movement, which was, as we said, the religious wing of the Zionist movement. It's true that many of the members, including some of the rabbis who were involved in the Mizrahi, looked up to Rav Kook as a kind of spiritual mentor, but he himself never openly identified with that organization. He never referred to himself as a Zionist. He understood that Zionism was something that had come into being, that had been called into being by Hashem in order to bring about this fantastic and immense change in Jewish affairs, a change for the better, but that the road ahead was going to be long and difficult, and that it needed to be lit up. That path that we had to now tread needed to be lit up, because it was, at this point, very much covered in darkness. And therefore Rav Kook saw the Zionist movement as a necessary development and something that was bringing about the essential physical and real world infrastructure for that the Jewish people would require in order to return to their homeland. But anything beyond that basic infrastructure, the basic building up of the land and creating the conditions which would allow a return to the Jewish homeland en masse in order that it become a true light unto the nations, this, Rav Kook understood, was entirely beyond the capabilities of the Zionist movement, and he apparently also realized that the Mizrahi movement was also not really capable of doing so. And this is why apparently Rav Kook attempted to set up another movement, a separate organization altogether, which he referred to as Degel Yerushalayim, to inject into the public sphere, the public domain and of Jewish debate and thought, these kinds of ideas, the need for lighting up and informing the national Jewish revival with the light of Torah.
The production of these videos and maintaining this channel demands much time and money. If you enjoyed this video, please show your appreciation and support. To make a donation, please go to www.machonshilo.org and press the PayPal button which appears on the upper right-hand side of the home page. To sponsor a video or purchase Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael, please write us at office@machonshilo.org.